The physics behind why motorcycles can lean. Throughout this presentation, I hope to explain the reasoning behind why motorcycles can lean. At first glance, one may think a motorcycle can lean because of gravity or friction. However, much more goes into a motorcycle lean. Many forces are acting on a motorcycle when in the leaning position. Without these forces, the bike would ultimately fall over. Why can motorcycles lean? The reason motorcycles can lean over so far is because of the many different forces and torques acting on the motorcycle. Each of these forces are important. However, some of them are used more than others. For example, when the bike is at 90 degrees, the force of friction could be 30 newtons. However, when the bike is at 50 degrees from the ground, the force of friction against the tires is 100 newtons. Each force depends on the angle of lean, condition of the tire, the bike's and the rider's weight, road conditions, and air density. There are many things we have to account for when dealing with a motorcycle leaning. Why do motorcycles lean? If motorcycles didn't lean, a person would just fall off the bike or be thrown off the bike. This is because of centrifugal force. This force pushes you and the bike the opposite way of centripetal force, or out of your turning radius. This is similar to Unit 4 when we learned about centripetal force. One example that fits well here is the gravitron. The gravitron spins and makes you feel like you are being pushed out of the gravitron. However, that feeling is just force normal pushing against you so you don't fall through the wall. There is no normal force against the side of your body when leaning on a motorbike because you're not against anything. However, there is a centrifugal force. Countersteering. Countersteering is arguably one of the most important skills to learn when leaning on a motorcycle. Countersteering is when a person turns the wheel the opposite direction of the want to travel. When one wants to go right, they turn left. When a person countersteers, it moves the wheel out from the motorcycle's center of gravity, which causes the bike to lean over because of gravity. When they want to go back to the normal riding position, they lean the opposite way and turn the wheel the opposite way. This type of steering is very important when trying to avoid obstacles. It's important to understand countersteering when riding a motorcycle. Otherwise, it could get you in accidents like this one. I will explain what happens in the video and what he could have done better. The rider steered in the wrong direction, which caused him to go into the truck. The rider turned to the right to try and avoid the truck. However, he was supposed to turn left to countersteer. Turning right made the bike go back up to its center of gravity and straighten. As you can see here, he steers right then releases, steers right then releases. After doing this, he was in the trajectory of the fire truck, which then ended up him hitting it. This is why leaning and countersteering is very important. Instead of going right and then releasing, he should have countersteered to the left, then his line of trajectory would have been more to the right and he would not have hit the truck. The force of friction is a very important force when a motorcycle is leaning. Friction is very important because it helps keep the bike upright. Without friction, the tires cannot get any traction, therefore having the bike slip and fall over. This concept is similar to our force and dynamics unit that we covered. A block sliding down a slant with no friction force tends to go faster than a block sliding down with friction. The friction of the block or motorcycle depends on two types of surfaces interacting. In our case, it would be rubber and asphalt, or whatever surface one is driving on. When leaning into a turn, the motorcycle wants to slide outwards. However, friction is pushing it the opposite way, helping keep the motorcycle in a steady lean. Force of gravity. Force of gravity is important to say the least. Without the force of gravity, one would just float like you were in space. Force of gravity has a lot to do with friction. We learned about force of gravity and friction in our dynamics unit. To find the force of friction, we do force of gravity equals mass times acceleration equals force normal, and force of friction equals force normal times the coefficient of friction. As you can tell, if our gravity was different, it would completely change our friction, therefore changing how our motorcycle leans. The force of gravity links everything together and is essential to lean a motorcycle. The other force that cancels with force gravity is force normal. Force normal pushes on the tires of the motorbike, so it does not fall to the ground. Torque and centrifugal force. As shown in the diagram, the centrifugal force and centripetal force cancel out, leaving the motorcycle in equilibrium. However, that is untrue because the torque is also acting on the motorcycle, and if the forces cancel out, then the bike could not turn. As we found in our torque unit, torque only exists when something is rotating. At first, one would think the motorcycle does not rotate, but in reality, it does. The tires on the ground act as a pivot point, and our centrifugal force acts on the center of mass. The centrifugal force creates a torque that allows the bike to rotate. If the leaning angle increases, all of our other forces also increase by an equal amount. However, as soon as one of the forces becomes unequal, the bike will fall. The most common fall is when one's friction force is no longer equal to counteract the other forces. Therefore, the bike loses traction and slides out. The centripetal force is caused by the friction of a tire against the pavement. As we learned from our dynamics unit, friction goes the opposite way of acceleration. In this case, acceleration of the tire is wanting to go out of the circle, while friction is pulling it in. Conclusion. Riding a motorcycle is relatively easy. However, knowing the science behind riding a motorcycle is not. This presentation was not easy. Finding accurate information was one of the hardest parts. After finding good information, it was very difficult to put it all together and present it. However, I was able to complete this presentation and have a much better understanding of how and why motorcycles lean. Before this presentation, I had no idea that torque was involved in the process of leaning a motorcycle. I also learned helpful tips like counter steering, which will help me learn to ride better in the future.